Okay, so welcome everybody to my presentation in the Conference of Social Ontology 2021. My topic today is non-binary genders in Ásta's Conferralist framework. I'm Siiri Porkkala from Tampere University and I'm a second-year dissertation student. The contents of my presentation are following. First, I will talk a little bit about what are non-binary genders. Then I will talk about Ásta's Conferralist framework that sets the general area of my presentation. Then I will apply the framework to non-binary genders, and after that I will talk about the specific problems that come with the application of the framework, and then I will talk a little bit about misgendering. So first, what are non-binary genders? In very simple terms, people who are non-binary are people whose gender falls in some manner outside of the typical gender binary of man and woman. And the identity of non-binary is not associated with any specific set of reproductive organs or secondary sexual characteristics or social roles or aesthetic presentation. And some non-binary individuals see themselves as trans people, while others do not identify with the label of trans. But in this specific context, I will use non-binary to describe people who are outside of the binary, binary trans or binary cisgenders, and the term non-binary is then understood as this sort of like umbrella term that will cover many different types of non-binary identities. And then we go to the Conferralist framework. The Conferralist framework is a theory about the constitutive construction of social categories, and it sees social construction as social significance. The framework is an externalist and descriptive account, and it is not meant to be. It is not meant to provide normative evaluations. The basics of Conferralist framework are following. People are conferred into categories based on their socially significant features. The conferred property that is given to someone is an attempt to track the base property that the person may or may not have. And this quote from Ásta, I think, illustrates this quite well. The social construction of F as the social significance of a feature B, which then serves as the basis for the conferral of F. And for a feature to have social significance in a context is for another feature, F, to be conferred upon people taken to have B. F is then the socially constructed feature. And so if we want to open this a little bit further, we can take someone to have conferred property P, and who is conferring this? A person or entity or group with social standing and authority. And what are they doing? They are giving their conferral, either explicit or implicit, by means of attitudes and behavior. And when does this happen? It happens in a particular context. And base properties are the property or properties that the authorities are attempting to track in the conferral, and it is done either consciously or unconsciously. And one good example is the status of being a refugee. So if we look into what are the operative properties of someone being a refugee, is having the legal status, but then there is also the additional category of being assumed a refugee that adds these constraints and enablements that the legal status of being a refugee does not in itself include. And this also illustrates the point that the conferral is both institutional and communal, and the difference in institutional and communal conferral is in the authority who is doing the conferral. Another point is how we understand the available and possible social roles, and they can be described with the metaphor of social maps. These maps are negotiated between people in a certain context, and they differ with each other. They have different salient and intelligible features. And the maps function in providing the available roles in a situation and define what other roles people and the person themselves who is doing the conferring are conferred into. And there are two different types of social identities that have to do with the maps. So we have objective social identity that people occupy in a stable manner, and it does not need to align with the subjective social identity. And subjective social identity is the location on a certain map that people feel comfortable in, and they take the norms and restrictions to be relevant to them. And it's also important to notice that this specific location might not be available in every context. So people can feel that they don't get the social identity that they don't have the social identity that they wish to have in a certain context, or there isn't a single one social identity that they would want to have. Okay, so now that we have laid out the basics of the framework of the Conferralist framework, we can then start to apply it to the specific case of non-binary genders. So I have differentiated two different types of contexts. One where non-binary genders, hereafter referred to as NB genders for the sake of brevity, where it is a possible conferral. So we can imagine that we have a queer-friendly workplace where some non-binary person is conferred as non-binary by their co-workers, and there are also institutional policies in place that allows them to identify as non-binary, have non-binary markers, for example, being referred to as MX or MX instead of Mr. or Mrs. or Miss. And in this context, non-binary gender is a salient conferral, and the person is, in the context of this framework, indeed non-binary. But in contrast, we can imagine that through some radical changes in management and workforce, the same workplace can become a place where the map that includes non-binary genders is no longer in use. So from that follows that non-binary gender is no longer a salient category for a conferral. So therefore, a person who previously has been conferred as non-binary no longer actually has that gender. And when the map that includes non-binary identities is in use, the conferral is done as any other conferral is done. And accordingly, if the map changes to another one that does not include those identities, the gender category of the individual changes too. And this is all according to the framework, and it's basically all good so far. But there are some problems when we are talking, especially about the conferred category of non-binary, because for binary genders we can easily imagine certain like stereotypical features that can act as base properties, such as I don't know, having typical sexual organs, or having certain types of social norms or restrictions that are relevant to them. But what about non-binary genders? What are the what could be the relevant properties that could function as base properties for the conferral of non-binary gender? So bodily presentation, behavioral expectations, role in reproduction, or pronoun badges, self-identification. And here is where we run into an issue, because there is no single or set of features that act in a similar manner as with binary genders. So we have this sort of like lack of intuitive base properties that creates some issues. And at this point, self-identification seems to be the most feasible one, but this includes an epistemic demand. The self-identification has to be communicated for people to know it, and for it to act as a as a base property, sorry. And this also includes this kind of like slight hazardous element, because there is this kind of like choice that non-binary, and this might also apply to trans people, have to make between being conferred an uncomfortable social identity, or possibly then if they do express their self-identity, they might expose themselves to possible social sanctions, or even in the worst case to violence. So this is one of the difficulties that we have because of the externalist nature of the Conferralist account. So then we move on to misgendering, and here I have gathered a couple of previous theories about misgendering. Talia May Betcher talks about the ethical first-person authority over one's own gender that gives us grounds to take people's accounts about their own gender identity as this sort of like ethical. We have this ethical demand that we have to take their authority over their own gender, and this works as this sort of like grounds why we should respect people's self-identification. And Kapustad has talked about misgendering as a linguistic form of harm and denial of category membership that the person identifies with, and this denial plays a part in making multiple forms of harm possible, from all the way from undermining self-respect to social oppression and microaggressions and basic denial of authenticity. And also, Esa Diaz-Leon has talked about misgendering in the context of response dependence account. So misgendering occurs when one person is disposed to induce the relevant gender response in the relevant subjects in manifesting conditions. But there are some situations where this person does not actually induce that response in the relevant subjects. So how about then misgendering in the Conferralist framework? Well, if the person is seen as having the relevant base property for being conferred the gender G, then they are that gender, regardless of factors that are not base properties in the specific context. And actually, all misclassifications of social properties are difficult to talk about in this framework, because the conferral of a social property cannot in itself be wrong. And in fact, it seems that people cannot be misgendered in the commonly understood sense if we use the constraints provided by the framework. There might be this sort of one type of misgendering where somebody actually makes a mistake about the category that group or people with authority are using, but it isn't actually the same thing that we are talking about when we are talking about misgendering in general sense. And it also seems that the Conferralist framework doesn't seem to capture the phenomenon that is generally meant by that we generally mean when we talk about misgendering, or the moral harms or wrongs that this misgendering includes. Because conferrals against self-identification are not different from any other types of conferrals, even though they are harmful for the individual. Okay, and so finally, I'll just pull all the threads together that I talked about during this presentation. So the lack of typical base properties makes it difficult to recognize non-binary genders and to be externalist about them, as they do not seem to exist, these typical base properties, in similar manner to other genders or the other base properties that people of different genders have. This might mean that non-binary genders as such have a difficult time existing as genders if we take them to be only conferable. But this is not only a problem with the Conferralist framework, but this is also a larger issue, because there is this sort of epistemic injustice in society that we don't have enough testimonies or enough even basic knowledge about non-binary genders for them to be salient in certain social contexts. And also, Conferralist account does not seem to subscribe to the idea that people have final authority over their own gender, at least not in the social sense. And this causes the Conferralist framework not to recognize the harms caused by misgendering as we mean it outside of the framework. And to conclude, I would say that especially in the case of non-binary people, the framework lacks certain tools for describing non-binary people's existence as non-binary in the social world. Okay, thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you.